Picture this. A Spanish farmer from the year 1000, he wakes up 500 years later.
Okay.
Seeing Columbus's ships, maybe it's not totally alien, Some things might feel familiar.
Right, navigable.
But what if one of Columbus's sailors woke up today? Our world, iPhones, internet.
Whoa. The shock would be, well, immense, just unimaginable.
Exactly. And that thought experiment, it really hits home the core idea for this deep dive.
Which is this astonishing rate of human development, really just in the last 500 years.
And the engine behind it all, something called the scientific revolution.
That's the focus.
So for this session, we've been digging into excerpts from Revolusi Sains1.pdf. And our mission for you, the learner, isn't just about the tech, the gadgets.
No, it goes deeper.
We want to understand the huge shifts in how we think, how society is built, even how we view happiness in the future now.
It's all connected back to this revolution.
Okay, let's unpack this then. What exactly happened around, say, 1500 that, set us off on this crazy fast trajectory?
Well, if you just look at the sheer scale of it all, the change since 1500 it's almost unbelievable.
Like what? Give us some numbers.
Okay, so human population, around 500 million back then. Today, over 7 billion. That's a 14-fold increase. Just massive.
14 times. Wow.
And the total value of goods and services produced each year, it jumped from maybe $250 billion estimate to nearly $60 trillion.
That's 240 times more.
240 times.
Yeah.
And our energy use, daily calorie consumption, basically energy, it's exploded.
Yeah.
About 115 times increase overall.
It's almost impossible to wrap your head around those figures.
It really is.
The source even has this striking comparison.
Yeah.
Imagine sending a modern battle axe back to 1500.
Right.
It could just shred Columbus's ships. Nina, Pinta, Santa Maria, gone in seconds.
Right. Even the strongest navy back then wouldn't stand a chance against, well, almost anything we have now.
And think about cities. In 1500, a city with over 100,000 people, super rare.
Very few.
Buildings, forget skyscrapers. If something was taller than, 3 stories, that was considered massive?
That really puts the limits of that time in perspective. And think about Magellan's voyage, circling the globe, finished in 1522.
Epic journey.
Absolutely epic, but it took 3 long, hard years. And most of the crew died, including Magellan himself.
It just shows how tough, how limited basic movement was.
Exactly.
Now fast forward to 1969, we've got humans walking on the moon.
It's an incredible leap. The source frames it not just technologically, but evolutionarily, cosmically even.
Yeah, first time in 4 billion years any creature left Earth's atmosphere.
And then we did. From walking and basic sailing to that.
And our understanding of life itself has totally changed. Back then, the whole microbial world, unknown.
Completely invisible. Now we know, 99.99% of life is microscopic?
It's mind-boggling. And that shift purely down to science developing.
It is.
And speaking of fundamental shifts, the source points to 1945, the first atomic bomb.
Ah, yes, Alamogordo.
A really pivotal moment, giving humanity the power not just to change history, but potentially to end it.
A heavy burden. So what's been the engine driving all this unprecedented change?
The source argues it's the scientific revolution, right? A time when we shifted away from thinking all the important knowledge was already out there.
Towards this new idea, this conviction that investing in scientific research could unlock totally new kinds of power.
Okay, so it wasn't just oh, we learned some new stuff. The source talks about a revolution of ignorance. What's that about?
Yeah, that's a key concept. It wasn't primarily about finding new knowledge, but about a fundamental shift in how we approach knowledge.
How so?
It was the realization that we don't know everything. That's the ignorance part. Before 1500, many traditions, religions, philosophies, they kind of assumed all the important answers were already known.
Through God or ancient thinkers or whatever.
Exactly. If you had a question, you asked the priest or the scholar who knew the old texts. Or maybe the question just wasn't considered important if the old text didn't cover it.
Which is a massive change from how science works today.
Totally different. Modern science starts by admitting ignorance. Ignoramus, we do not know.
Right.
Scientists actively look for the unknowns. They make hypotheses. They test them. The source points to 3 big advantages of this modern approach.
Okay, what are they?
1, the willingness to admit ignorance. 2, the huge importance placed on observation and mathematics working together. And 3, the ability this gives us to actually gain new power, new capabilities.
It's a completely different way of looking at the world. The source uses Darwin, evolution, and economics as examples of this flexibility.
Yeah, and science embraces this need to constantly update itself. Darwin didn't claim his theory was the final word, right? Scientists keep testing it, refining it.
Same with economics. Theories get challenged by real-world stuff all the time.
Exactly. That adaptability, that willingness to say, okay, maybe we were wrong here, let's figure it out, that's a core strength.
The source also mentions, though, that some political ideologies haven't always been comfortable with that flexibility.
Well, yeah, if you think about it, some systems prefer, fixed answers, certainty. The open-ended nature of science can be unsettling.
So they might try to, what, use science selectively?
The source suggests that, yeah, regimes might cherry-pick findings or try to fit science into their existing dogma.
But then it notes, kind of ironically, that science itself often needs support from those very systems.
And that's a crucial point about funding. Science isn't free. Research costs a lot. And historically, a lot of that funding has come from governments, from political and ideological interests. And that inevitably shapes what gets studied.
Okay, so modern science admits it doesn't know everything, it updates itself. The second key thing was observation and math.
Right. Relying on empirical observation, basically. Collecting data through our senses, through experiments.
But it's not just collecting facts.
No, exactly. Scientists are trained to build on what came before. They develop theories to explain the observations. And crucially, these theories have to be testable. You need to be able to prove them wrong.
They're not just accepting Einstein's work as gospel.
No, they use it as a foundation to ask new questions, push further.
And that's a big difference from religious texts, right? The source notes the lack of math formulas explaining nature in Scripture.
Generally speaking, yes. Religious texts offer moral guidance, spiritual meaning, but they don't usually provide mathematical models for, say, planetary motion.
Unlike Newton's Principia Mathematica back in 1687.
Exactly. That was huge. Suddenly you have mathematical equations describing how things move, apples falling, planets orbiting. The natural world could be described, predicted, using numbers.
Though the source admits not everything can be boiled down to simple equations.
That's important. Biology, economics, psychology, these deal with incredibly complex systems. Much harder to capture in neat formulas. But the basic idea of using data, quantitative methods, that's still key.
And the source has that great story about the Scottish ministers using math for life insurance.
Yeah, Alexander Webster and Robert Wallace, 1744. They used statistical data, worked with a math professor to figure out mortality rates for clergymen.
Practical application.
Totally. It wasn't just abstract theory. It directly led to creating a life insurance fund. Based on probability, statistics, the foundation of the whole modern insurance industry, really.
It just shows how math has spread everywhere, forcing more people to learn it.
Absolutely. Psychology, linguistics, economics. Quantitative thinking is vital now. It's a powerful tool for understanding, well, pretty much everything.
Okay, third key. Science acquires new power. But the source also says science can be hard for people to grasp.
Yeah, that's fair. Science often uses complex language, lots of math. And sometimes its findings just don't match our everyday intuition. That can be a barrier.
Which brings us to Francis Bacon, the new instrument. He argued knowledge is power.
Yes, but specifically power defined by its usefulness. Bacon's idea was pretty revolutionary. He said the real value of knowledge isn't just knowing stuff. It's about what it lets you do.
If it doesn't have a practical use, it's not reaching its potential.
That was his argument. Knowledge should empower us, give us new abilities.
And the source points out that science and technology actually coming together after 1500 was a relatively new thing.
That's a key insight. Before then, they often developed on separate tracks. You had scholars doing science, artisans doing tech. Bacon connecting them, seeing how science could drive tech and vice versa. That was a major shift in the 17th century.
The source mentions science in World War II, obviously huge, but also makes that surprising point about earlier military changes being more about organization.
Yeah, it's interesting. Before the 19th century, while tech mattered in war, big shifts often came from new tactics, better organization, logistics.
Not just better swords or cannons.
Right. It was really the rise of capitalism and the Industrial Revolution that properly fused science, industry, and the military. That's when you see the really rapid advances in military tech, like in the 20th century.
Now, before all this scientific revolution stuff, the source says people were generally skeptical about the idea of progress. They looked back to a golden age.
That's right. Many cultures had this idea of a perfect past or saw history as cyclical. The notion that humanity could just keep getting better and better through new discoveries wasn't really the default view.
But as people saw the power science offered, that started to shift.
Exactly. Realizing we were ignorant but could learn, and that learning gave us new power that fostered this belief in potential positive change. Benjamin Franklin and his kite experiment is a great example.
Challenging old ideas like lightning being divine punishment.
Right, using scientific inquiry to understand it instead.
And this even changed how poverty was viewed.
Yeah. Instead of just being an unavoidable fact of life, maybe even religiously sanctioned, poverty started to be seen as a technical problem, something progress could solve.
The source distinguishes between social poverty and biological poverty, like basic survival needs.
And it notes that biological poverty, thankfully, has drastically declined in many parts of the world due to science and economic development.
Then the source turns to the biggest mystery, death. Historically, more acceptance, maybe.
It seems that way. For most of history, death was seen as inevitable, a natural end. The Epic of Gilgamesh, seeking immortality but ultimately failing, kind of reflects that ancient resignation.
But modern science sees it differently. Not fate, but a technical problem.
Exactly. Like poverty, something to be overcome. We've already made huge strides with vaccines, antibiotics, genetic engineering, dramatically increasing lifespans.
And now the goals are even more ambitious, extending life indefinitely.
It sounds like sci-fi, but yes. Biotech to slow aging, nanotech to repair damage, even uploading consciousness.
The source admits it sounds wild, people are skeptical, but points to how fast tech moves.
Yeah, what seemed impossible yesterday is being seriously researched today. The potential for changing what it means to be human is, well, immense.
Yeah.
Even if the ethical hurdles are huge.
Okay, but science needs funding. The source stresses it's not neutral, it's expensive.
Crucial point. Scientific progress over the last 500 years hasn't happened in a vacuum. It's been fueled by massive investment.
From governments, businesses, donors.
Right. And these funders usually expect something in return. Economic benefits, political advantage, maybe even supporting an ideology.
So who pays the piper calls the tune, basically. Influences what gets researched.
To a large extent, yes. The U.S. government pouring money into nuclear physics led to nuclear power and nuclear weapons. The direction science takes is definitely shaped by funding priorities. It's not always a pure search for truth.
The source gives that stark example, funding global expeditions in the 16th century versus ignoring child psychology.
It's telling, isn't it? If research didn't seem to offer immediate economic or political gain, like understanding child development back then, it often got overlooked. Compare that to the huge sums spent trying to find new trade routes or resources for empires.
It really shows how external interests steer the ship.
Definitely. And you could argue the same happens today. Think about which areas get massive funding versus others that might be just as important for human well-being, but less commercially viable.
And the source concludes this bit by saying, current priorities, AI, biotech, space, are funded because of their potential future impact.
Yeah, it's all about the expected future payoff, whether that's economic, technological, or geopolitical dominance.
Okay, let's dive into that tangled history of science and imperialism, starting with measuring the distance to the sun using Venus.
Right, the transit of Venus observations in the 18th century. What's amazing is the global scale. The Royal Society sent expeditions literally all over the world.
Including Charles Green going to Tahiti in 1768.
Exactly. These weren't just armchair calculations. They involved huge logistical efforts and voyages to remote places.
And it wasn't just astronomy they learned, was it?
Not at all. These trips brought back tons of data on geography, climate, plants, animals, local cultures. Green's voyage, for instance, really fueled European fascination with the South Pacific.
Plus medical breakthroughs, like figuring out scurvy.
Absolutely. James Linn's experiments in the 1740s showed citrus fruits worked. James Cook later made sure his ships were stocked with things like cabbage, based on that idea.
And it dramatically cut deaths from scurvy, a huge deal for sailors.
Massive. But the source immediately pivots to the dark side.
These expeditions also paved the way for colonization.
Undeniably. Cook's voyages, scientifically valuable as they were, directly enabled British expansion in the Pacific. This led to, well, the disruption and often destruction of indigenous cultures, huge population declines.
And even unethical stuff like collecting human remains for research.
Sadly, yes. The story of Dragini's remains in Tasmania is a tragic example.
It really forces that question the source asks. Was Cook's trip science escorted by the military or the other way around?
It's blurry, isn't it? The line was incredibly thin. Science provided tools, knowledge, even justification for imperial goals.
Okay, shifting focus to Europe's rise. Before the late 15th century, Western Europe wasn't the powerhouse it became.
Not at all. Compared to the big players in the Middle East, India, China, Europe was relatively marginal.
But between 1500 and 1750, something changed. They became a major force, especially overseas.
They did, particularly in the Americas and on the oceans.
Right.
But the source is careful to note that economically, Asia, especially India and China, was still dominant until around 1775.
Then came the big shift, 1750 to 1950. Europe grabs control of much of Asia, the global economy.
Yeah, by 1900, Europe achieved pretty much global dominance, and the source argues modern science, especially after 1850, was a huge factor.
Developing the tech for conquest and control, weapons, medicine, logistics.
Exactly. Scientists provided the advanced weapons, the machines, the medicines to survive new climates, even ways to preserve food for long campaigns. Logistics were key for empire building.
But it also says European tech wasn't always superior before 1850.
Right. Cook had better tech than Aboriginal Australians, maybe, but 18th century Europe still lagged behind China or the Ottomans in some areas. Which raises the question.
Why Europe? Why did they lead the charge in colonization, not China or others?
The source suggests it wasn't just tech. It might have been differences in values, culture, social structures, maybe even bureaucracy, that fostered innovation and, crucially, the will to expand.
Like the examples of railways being slow to take off in China and Persia.
Exactly. Having the tech isn't enough if the society isn't set up to embrace and exploit it effectively. The conclusion seems to be that modern science and capitalism, developing uniquely in Europe, were the key combination.
And imperialism and science fed off each other.
A symbiotic relationship. Imperial expansion funded and directed science, and science provided the tools and justification for empire.
And while smart people were everywhere, the big scientific leaps in that crucial period mostly happened in Europe.
That concentration of breakthroughs was definitely a factor, though science has obviously become much more global since then.
This leads to the idea of the mindset behind it all. The, mentality of exploration.
Yeah, it's this fascinating link. Both modern science and European imperialism shared this spirit of, well, acknowledging ignorance and wanting to find out. Let's go see what's over there.
Different from older empires just spreading what they already believed.
Largely, yes. Older empires were often about consolidating known territory, spreading their existing truth. The European explorers, like Cook, da Gama, Columbus, they were driven by this desire to discover, to map, to know, often before they even claimed power.
Seeking knowledge first, then power.
Or at least seeking knowledge alongside power. And this mix intensified over centuries. Military trips increasingly included scientists.
Like Darwin on the Beagle in 1831, a scientific voyage on a military ship.
Perfect example. That fusion of exploration science and imperial reach.
The source has that really poignant story about the Apollo 11 astronauts and the Native American elder.
Oh, the secret message to the moon spirit.
It just cuts right through the pure exploration narrative, doesn't it? Shows the indigenous view.
Absolutely. The elder's suspicion, the translated message being about warning the spirit the explorers were coming to take their land. It reveals that deep-seated tension, the clash of intentions.
And this, mindset even showed up on maps.
That's what the source argues. Older maps often filled in the blanks, maybe with mythical stuff. But 15th, 16th century maps started showing large empty spaces.
Acknowledging the unknown.
Exactly. Reflecting this new drive to explore, fueled by both scientific curiosity and imperial goals.
Which brings us neatly to Columbus. His discovery of the Americas wasn't exactly planned that way.
Not at all. He was working off bad maps, thought Asia was much closer going west. He literally bumped into a whole continent he didn't know existed.
And he never really got it, did he?
No. He died believing he'd reached the East Indies. That's why he called the people Indians. A massive misconception he held on to.
The source stresses how huge this accidental discovery was, realizing half the world was basically unknown to Europeans.
It fundamentally challenged old traditions, old knowledge. Suddenly, direct observation, seeing this new land, trumped ancient texts. It was like finding a whole new book of reality.
And this just poured fuel on the fire for more European exploration and colonization.
Absolutely. On a scale never seen before. Unlike, say, Zheng. His voyages for China, which were more diplomatic, the European drive was overwhelmingly about conquest, claiming territory, extracting resources.
And the source says it wasn't superior tech initially, but this relentless ambition that drove them,
Yeah, the ambition came first, the insatiable desire to explore, to conquer, to profit.
which led to incredibly fast conquests, like Cortez taking down the Aztec Empire.
Astonishingly fast. Starts around 1517, and within 4 years, the mighty Aztec capital falls. And the Aztecs had no idea the Spanish had already been colonizing the Caribbean.
So the Spanish just showing up, looking alien with horses and guns, must have seemed otherworldly.
Totally bewildering. And Cortez used that. The source describes his strategy. Seem peaceful, get inside the capital, grab the emperor, then take over.
Oh, Daedalus.
Incredibly bold. And ultimately, despite fierce Aztec resistance later, the constant flow of Spanish reinforcements sealed their fate.
Then, less than 10 years later, Pizarro does the same to the Incas in Peru.
And again, the Incas seem to have been completely unaware of what happened to the Aztecs. This isolation between the major American empires made them vulnerable.
Now, the source draws a contrast between how earlier conquerors ruled and how the British, for example, operated. The British brought scholars.
Yeah, there was a shift towards more systematic investigation of the lands they conquered. Unlike, say, the Muslim conquerors of India, who didn't focus on digging into the region's deep history or environment scientifically, the British often brought archaeologists, anthropologists, geologists.
Like the rediscovery of Mohenjo-Daro, entire lost civilization.
Exactly. That uncovering of the Indus Valley civilization, forgotten for centuries, shows this new imperial focus on investigating and documenting the past of the conquered lands.
And the story of Henry Rawlinson deciphering cuneiform while on military duty.
It's amazing dedication, right? Dangling off the Behistun rock to copy inscriptions, driven by this passion to understand a lost language, even while serving the empire.
William Jones, the Asiatic Society in India. That was key too.
Hugely important. Jones arriving in 1783, founding the society. His realization of the connections between Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin that basically founded modern linguistics.
And the justification was that understanding the conquered helps you rule them better.
That was the argument. Imperial scientists believed knowing the local languages, cultures, history was essential for effective governance, which led to Europeans, in some ways, knowing more about India's history than many Indians did at the time.
But science was also used ideologically, right? To justify empire as progress.
Oh, absolutely. Framing it as bringing knowledge, civilization, enlightenment, even when the real motives were often economic exploitation, like in Bengal after 1764.
The source stresses it's complex, though, not just one simple story.
Very true. Imperialism was messy, full of contradictions. You could tell many different stories about it, all with some truth.
So scientists helped the empires and in return got funding, access, protection.
A definite quid pro quo. The source concludes modern science owes a real debt, maybe an uncomfortable one, to those colonial ambitions.
Okay, let's switch gears to the engine behind much of this. Capitalism, money, credit, vital for empires and science.
Absolutely fundamental. You can't build empires or fund massive scientific projects without serious cash. The source uses that fictional example, Samuel Greedy's bank in El Dorado.
Right, with the contractor and the baker, Jane, to explain credit creation.
Yeah, fractional reserve banking. The idea that banks can lend out way more money than they physically hold in deposits.
Because it's all based on trust in the future.
Exactly. It relies on a shared belief, an imagination really, that the future will be prosperous enough to pay back the loans. Jane's Bakery represents that future potential.
And this was different from pre-modern times. Less optimism, maybe moral concerns about getting rich?
Generally, yes. Pre-modern societies often didn't have that same robust faith in constant future growth. And sometimes accumulating too much wealth was seen as, well, maybe not quite right, that limited credit.
But the belief in progress, fueled by science and tech, changed that.
That's the argument. The scientific revolution created this optimism, this idea that investing now could lead to bigger returns later. That belief system was absolutely crucial for credit to take off and the whole capitalist engine to start roaring. A positive feedback loop.
Which connects to Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, 1776, the win-win idea.
Revolutionary idea back then. Smith argued that wealth creation wasn't a zero-sum game. My getting richer could actually help you get richer by creating demand, jobs, trade.
But the key is reinvesting profits, right? Not just spending it all.
That's the core of capitalism, according to the source. reinvesting capital, money, resources, whatever, back into production to make even more, not just hoarding it or spending it on fancy palaces.
A constant drive for growth, unlike older systems focused on maintaining things.
Exactly. Capitalism demands growth. It's become more than just economics. It's like an ethic, shaping how individuals think, how governments act. Always leaning for growth, always needing faith in the future.
The source even compares Columbus looking for funding to a modern startup founder pitching investors.
It's a good analogy. Capitalism was key not just for science, but for imperialism too. And credit systems got turbocharged by imperialism.
Credit existed before, but it really took off in early modern Europe more than in China or India.
Yes. In Europe, merchants and bankers gained more influence. Their interests started aligning more with rulers and generals. This led to these huge credit-fueled ventures exploration, conquest, all driven by the potential for profit. Columbus pitching his voyage is a prime example.
And when early ventures, like conquering the Americas, paid off big time,
That built investor confidence. Huge risks, yes, but potentially huge rewards, which led to more investment, more sophisticated financial tools.
competition between European powers like Spain and the Netherlands pushed financial innovation too.
Definitely. The Dutch revolt against Spain shows the power of good credit. The Dutch were meticulous about paying debts, protecting property rights. That built trust, attracted capital, let them punch way above their weight against Spain.
Spain's king, meanwhile, was less reliable with investors.
Right. Relying more on taxes, sometimes defaulting on debts that undermine confidence.
Then came stock ownership, shares, like the Dutch East India Company, the VOC.
Founded 1602,
Okay.
a classic example. They raised massive capital by selling shares, used for trade, yes, but also for military campaigns, eventually conquering Indonesia over nearly 200 years, all funded by private investors looking for profit.
Later came other companies, shifts in power to Britain, France, but also disasters like the Mississippi bubble.
Yeah, that French fiasco around 1717 shows the danger of speculative bubbles when confidence gets detached from reality. A painful lesson.
But British private companies, like the East India Company, were hugely successful in colonization.
Amazingly so. The EIC basically conquered India with its own private army, bigger than the British Crown's army at times, shows the power of these capitalist enterprises.
And even after decolonization, the link between capitalism and empire just changed form.
The source argues yes. It became less about direct rule, more about economic influence. Large corporations wielding power, often relying on their home governments to protect their global interests. Think about the Opium Wars.
Right. Driven by British capitalist interests, the opium trade, leading to war with China?
A stark example. Or Egypt falling deep into debt to European investors over things like the Suez Canal, leading to more European control.
Even war itself became an investment vehicle. Greek rebellion bonds.
Yeah, you could literally invest in a war, hoping for a return if your side won. Shows how intertwined finance and conflict became.
And a country's political stability matters more for credit than just having resources.
Absolutely. Investors need confidence that contracts will be honored, property protected. Political stability and predictable foreign policy build that trust, often more than just having oil or diamonds.
Which leads to that ongoing debate, free markets versus regulation.
The eternal tension. How much should government intervene to prevent exploitation, monopolies, injustice, versus letting the market operate freely?
Because the source points out the potential dark side. Profit maximization hurting workers.
Capitalism doesn't inherently protect workers from low wages or bad conditions if profit is the only goal. Regulations often arise to counterbalance that.
And their really dark history. Capitalism thriving alongside the slave trade.
A crucial, grim point. The transatlantic slave trade was fueled by the free market. People bought and sold shares in slave voyages. It wasn't separate from capitalism. In many ways, it powered its early growth in the Americas, especially with sugar plantations.
Driven by demand, funded by credit, traded on exchanges.
Exactly. Plus other examples like the Bengal famine under the EIC or the harsh conditions for workers during the Industrial Revolution.
Or King Leopold's horrific exploitation of the Congo.
Done under the guise of a humanitarian mission, but driven by brutal resource extraction for profit.
The source suggests maybe fears of communism put some brakes on the worst excesses after 1945.
Perhaps. But inequality persists, even worsened in some ways. Some people in the developing world might be materially worse off now than their ancestors.
So, what are the main defenses of capitalism against these criticisms?
Two main lines, according to the source. One, it's simply the most effective system we have for generating wealth, despite flaws. Two, the promise that continued growth will eventually lift everyone up, creating a bigger pie for all, even if distribution is uneven now.
While acknowledging that overall material well-being has generally improved.
On average, yes, though averages can hide a lot of variation.
Okay, let's tackle the resource question. Will we run out of energy and materials? The source seems optimistic.
It counters that fear by looking at history. Yes, consumption has soared, but human innovation keeps expanding the available resources. Think cars again. Wood and iron initially, now countless advanced materials.
We used to rely solely on plants for energy, right? Sun, muscle power.
For millennia, yeah.
Yeah.
The energy cycle was based on plants capturing sunlight. Human and animal muscle did most of the work.
And we overlooked heat as energy, even though we used it for cooking.
It took a surprisingly long time to figure out how to convert heat into motion effectively.
First gunpowder, then firearms, then finally the steam engine.
Gunpowder in China, 9th century, was an early step. But the steam engine burning coal to make steam to power machines, that was the real game changer.
Revolutionized textile production in Britain, then led to trains around 1825.
Completely transformed industry and transport.
Then the internal combustion engine turned petroleum into liquid gold.
Yeah, suddenly oil, which had limited uses before, became this vital global resource powering cars, planes.
Same story with electricity, from curiosity to essential.
Exactly. We kept finding new ways to unlock and convert energy.
So modern growth isn't just money and trust, it's also about getting better at converting energy.
That's a key takeaway. The Industrial Revolution was fundamentally an energy revolution, proving that limits are often about knowledge, not the sheer amount of energy out there.
So despite fears of running out, the source says the real issue is knowing how to capture and convert energy efficiently.
Pretty much. The amount of energy hitting the Earth from the sun every day dwarfs what we use from fossil fuels. We just haven't figured out how to grab and use most of it effectively yet.
Think of the difference between what plants capture and what the sun delivers.
Huge difference. Before industry, maybe 3,000 exajoules a year from plants. The sun delivers over 3.7 million exajoules annually to Earth. Massive, untapped potential.
And cheap energy lets us get resources from tough places, create new materials.
Like plastics, or accessing minerals deep underground or far away.
The aluminum example is great. Once rarer than gold, now everywhere.
Because we found a cheap way to extract it in the late 19th century. Before that, despite being common in the Earth's crust, it was incredibly expensive.
And think of all the modern materials replacing traditional ones, olive oil versus supermarket chemicals.
Most materials we rely on daily were discovered or synthesized in the last 200 years, enabled by this energy revolution.
Fritz Haber synthesizing nitrates from air during WWI, critical.
Saved Germany's war effort when their natural nitrate supply was cut off. Shows how scientific breakthroughs can overcome resource limits, with huge consequences.
So conclusion. The Industrial Revolution brought cheap energy and materials, fueling an explosion in productivity, especially in farming.
Right, which leads to the next big transformation.
We usually picture factories, but the source says the Industrial Revolution hit agriculture just as hard, the mechanization of life.
Yeah, it wasn't just factories. Tractors replaced animals and people. But it goes further. The source talks about the mechanization of plants and animals themselves.
Treating livestock like machines, ignoring their living beings.
That's the provocative idea. Focusing purely on output, efficiency, often disregarding the animal's natural behaviors, needs, sentience.
The source gives examples. Hens in tiny cages, confined pigs and cows.
Conditions driven by maximizing production in minimal space, often causing significant distress.
And it suggests this is often indifference, not deliberate cruelty. Consumers just don't know.
There's often a disconnect. People buy the end product without seeing the process. Plus, the old idea that animals don't really have complex emotions still lingers, despite scientific evidence against it.
Mammals, birds, they have complex nervous systems, emotions, social needs.
Absolutely. These things evolved because they were crucial for survival and reproduction in the wild. Industrial systems often ignore that evolutionary heritage.
Like separating calves from mothers. Objectively, they might survive, but emotionally.
It highlights that conflict. What's healthy in a narrow production sense might be deeply distressing from the animal's subjective perspective.
Harry Harlow's monkey experiments showed that need for comfort, connection.
Devastatingly effective experiments in the 50s showed baby monkeys preferred a soft cloth mother with no milk over a wire mother with milk. Comfort and connection were more fundamental than just food. Emotional deprivation had severe long-term effects.
And the scale of modern farming. 10 billion animals a year. raises huge ethical questions.
It's a massive trade-off. More food, freeing humans from farm labor, but potentially at the cost of immense animal suffering.
Okay, moving to consumption. Modern capitalism needs constant production, but also constant consumption.
Yes, the engine needs fuel at both ends.
Yeah.
You can't just make stuff, people have to buy it, or the whole system stalls. Leads to the compulsion to consume.
Which is a total flip from history, where scarcity was normal and thrift was good.
Exactly. Now, spending more is seen as positive for the economy. Indulgence is encouraged. Treat yourself.
The source has that funny cereal box quote, "Indulge," right next to health treats.
Perfectly captures the paradox. Consumerism accommodates everything, as long as you're buying something.
We're now good consumers, buying stuff we don't need, maybe because the old stuff is designed to break. Planned obsolescence.
That's part of it. Plus the constant desire for the new, the fashionable, to keep up.
Shopping as a hobby, using purchases to signal identity, connect with others.
It's become deeply ingrained in culture. What you buy says something about who you are, what tribe you belong to.
And the food market impact? Hunger used to be the problem, now it's obesity.
A stark reversal in many parts of the world. We spend fortunes on diets, often more than it would cost to feed the hungry globally.
How does the ethic of capitalism, save invest, fit with consumerism, spend?
The source suggests a kind of division of labor. The rich, the elite, they do the investing, the masses do the consuming. Keeps the whole cycle going.
A revolutionary new ethic compared to old virtues. An easier path to paradise.
Maybe more accessible, yeah. Work hard, buy stuff, feel good. Less demanding than, say, lifelong piety or self-denial.
This industrial engine has reshaped the planet, obviously, transforming landscapes for human needs.
Driven by that cheap energy and mass production, yeah. Huge environmental impact.
The biomass statistics are wild. Humans plus our livestock outweighing wild animals massively.
300 million tons of humans, 700 million tons of domesticated animals versus maybe 100 million tons of wild, large animals left. Shows our dominance starkly.
But the source distinguishes between running out of resources, less likely, maybe, and environmental damage, bigger threat.
Right. We're good at finding new resources or substitutes. Pollution, climate change, habitat destruction. Those are the boomerang effects that threaten us.
So the future is a race between innovation and the consequences of our own actions.
Could be. We're not destroying nature, perhaps, but radically transforming it, often in ways that might not sustain us long term.
And the population boom since the Industrial Revolution just magnifies everything.
From 700 million in 1700 to nearly 7 billion today. Huge pressure on the planet.
While we became less tied to nature cycles, we became slaves to the clock, the demands of industry.
That's the irony. Less dependent on sunrise and seasons, more dependent on factory whistles and train schedules.
Farming time was flexible, industrial time needs precision, uniformity.
Because everything's interconnected. One delay on the assembly line messes everything up. Tasks have to be synchronized.
And that factory schedule spread to schools, hospitals, government, transport.
It imposed a new rhythm on society. Everything had to align with the industrial timetable.
Even global time synchronization came from railways needing coordinated schedules.
Yeah, the first commercial railway in 1830 made it obvious you couldn't have different local times if trains were running between cities. Led eventually to standardized time zones.
And now we're surrounded by clocks, constantly aware of the time.
It's woven into the fabric of modern life. The tyranny of the clock, as the source puts it.
The Industrial Revolution also shattered old social structures. Urbanization, decline of farming.
Massive changes. Rise of factory workers, cities booming, more power shifting to younger generations.
But the big shift the source highlights is from small communities, family, to the state, and the market being dominant.
Traditional communities didn't vanish, but their role changed. The state and the market took over, providing many material needs, security, even identity.
But they also need to create a sense of belonging to replace the old community ties.
Exactly, which leads to the idea of imagined communities.
Nations, consumer tribes,
Yeah.
large groups of strangers feeling connected.
Yeah, you feel kinship with millions of people you'll never meet just because you share a nationality or like the same brands.
Not totally new kingdoms, religions did this before, but modern versions are powerful.
Nationalism and consumerism work hard to build these shared identities, shared stories, shared goals among vast populations, often based on, well, imagined connections.
But like money or human rights, these imagined things have real power.
Absolutely. They shape politics, economics, culture, war.
Nations build narratives of shared history, culture. Saddam Hussein claiming Babylonian heritage.
Perfect example. creating a story to unify people under a national banner.
Consumer tribes do it through shared habits, products, skincare communities, K-drama fans.
Same principle, different basis. Shared consumption creates a sense of belonging.
And social change itself has sped up incredibly in the last 200 years.
The revolutions used to be rare, now they seem almost constant. The social order feels much more fluid, flexible.
Like we feel we can design society how we want.
There's that sense of control, yes, but the source warns.
Big changes can mean big violence, like earthquakes from shifting tectonic plates.
Exactly. Rapid social transformation often comes with instability and conflict.
Which leads to the paradox of peace, the post-WWI era being the most peaceful ever, statistically.
It seems counterintuitive with all the conflicts we see on the news, but statistically, yes. Large-scale interstate wars have become much rarer compared to most of human history.
So the rarity makes each conflict seem bigger.
That could be part of it. But the numbers are striking. In 2000, for instance, far more deaths from crime and suicide than war.
And personal safety is up in many places thanks to states and laws.
Generally, yes. Even dictatorships often provide more day-to-day safety from random violence than many pre-modern societies did.
Interstate violence is way down.
Dramatically so.
The peaceful end of European empires after 1945 contrasts sharply with historical collapses.
Think about the Soviet Union dissolving relatively peacefully compared to, say, the Roman Empire's fall. A huge shift.
And new nations mostly haven't gone on conquering sprees.
Not in the traditional sense, no.
Even troubled regions like South America or the Arab world have had few interstate wars recently.
Conflicts are often internal, civil wars or proxy conflicts, rather than nation A invading nation B for territory.
Africa, too, mostly civil wars.
While tragic, it's a different pattern from earlier eras of constant conquest.
Why? The source lists reasons. Nukes making big wars unwinnable.
Mutually assured destruction is a huge deterrent, yes.
Wealth being harder to steal now. It's knowledge, systems.
Can't just loot Silicon Valley's intellectual property like you could loot gold.
Peace being more profitable. Trade, investment.
Globalization means economies are too interconnected. War disrupts everything.
And a shift in political culture. Elites seeing peace as desirable.
Maybe a growing understanding that war is usually lose-lose in the modern era. Plus, international institutions, diplomacy.
But perspectives differ on whether it feels peaceful.
Depends on where you live and what you focus on, for sure.
Okay, the ultimate question then. Has all this progress made us happier?
The million-dollar question, or maybe $1 trillion now. After all that change, are we actually better off in terms of well-being?
Historians usually focus on power, not people's happiness.
True. Less focus on the subjective experience of ordinary folks throughout history.
The source asks those provocative questions. Were Babylonians happier than hunter-gatherers? Egyptians happier under Islam? Algerians under France?
Questions we rarely ask, let alone answer rigorously. How did big historical shifts impact average happiness?
Philosophers have thought about happiness forever, but systematic study is recent, from psychology and biology.
Yeah, trying to measure it scientifically, looking at factors like money, health, genes, relationships, kindness.
How do they measure it? Subjective well-being surveys.
Mostly, yes. Asking people how satisfied they are with their lives.
And the findings. Money helps, but only up to a point.
Diminishing returns, basically. Once basic needs are met, more money doesn't automatically mean much more happiness. Illness matters too. But long-term impact depends on severity and adaptation.
What really correlates strongly?
Family and social connections. Strong relationships are consistently linked to higher happiness.
And the crucial insight. Happiness depends on the gap between reality and expectations.
That seems key. It's not just what you have, but how it measures up to what you expect or feel you deserve.
Which makes judging past happiness really hard. We project our expectations onto them.
Exactly. How can we know what a medieval peasant truly expected from life? Our standards are totally different.
And ironically, mass media and ads constantly raise our expectations today.
By showing us idealized lives,
Yeah.
perfect bodies, endless possessions, it can create unrealistic comparisons and actually undermine our baseline happiness.
That example of the village kid versus the social media user.
Right. Constant exposure to curated perfection can make your own perfectly good life feel inadequate.
Then there's the biological view. Happiness is brain chemistry. Serotonin, dopamine.
This perspective suggests our feelings are largely biochemical events. And maybe we each have a kind of genetic set point for happiness.
The hedonic treadmill. We adapt, return to baseline.
Yeah, win the lottery, you're ecstatic for a while, then you basically level off. Suffer a setback, you're down, but often adapt over time.
So a medieval peasant and a modern banker might have similar baseline happiness despite vastly different lives, determined by their brain chemistry.
It's a provocative thought. Suggests maybe huge historical changes, plagues, revolutions, prosperity, might have less long-term impact on average happiness than we assume if our biology is the main driver.
Which leads to the idea of just manipulating our biochemistry directly. Huxley's Brave New World and Soma.
If happiness is just chemicals, why not take a shortcut? Raises huge ethical questions, obviously.
But is happiness just feeling good? The source brings in meaning.
Right. Research, like Daniel Kahneman's, shows that things which aren't always pleasurable moment to moment, like raising kids, can be sources of deep satisfaction and meaning.
So maybe we don't always know what makes us truly happy. Meaning might trump pleasure.
It suggests happiness is more complex than just chasing pleasant sensations. Having a sense of purpose might be more fundamental.
Like historically, finding meaning through religion, serving a cause, community reputation.
Those provided frameworks for a meaningful life, which in turn could lead to a sense of well-being, even amidst hardship.
Which contrasts with a purely scientific view of life as maybe random, purposeless evolution.
If there's no inherent cosmic purpose, finding meaning becomes a more personal, perhaps more challenging task.
Maybe happiness comes when our personal sense of meaning clicks with the world around us.
When our life feels like it makes sense within the broader narrative of our culture or community.
So both views, pleasure and meaning, see happiness as subjective, leads to the liberal ideal.
You do you. Follow your heart, choose your own path. Individual autonomy is paramount.
But do we always know what's best for our own happiness? The source questions this.
Citing religious views, like St. Paul struggling with temptation, or evolutionary biology, Dawkins suggesting our genes prioritize survival reproduction over individual happiness, hence things like addiction.
We might be driven by impulses that don't actually lead to well-being.
Exactly. Challenging the simple, if it feels good, do it idea.
And the Buddhist perspective offers a whole different framework.
A very sophisticated analysis of suffering, desire, and the path to a different kind of contentment, distinct from Western models.
Finally, the source looks ahead. Homo sapiens might not be the endpoint.
We might be moving from natural selection to intelligent design, our intelligent design.
Through genetic engineering, biotech, AI.
Technologies that could allow us to fundamentally alter ourselves, maybe even create new species, modified humans, cyborgs, fully conscious AI.
Which raises huge questions about our own future relevance. Are we just a stepping stone?
Are we about to engineer our own successors? What does that mean for humanity?
The source doesn't give answers, but stresses the immense responsibility.
Ethical, social, spiritual implications are massive.
Mm-hmm.
We have godlike power now, but do we have godlike wisdom?
And the concluding thought loops back to that central question, are we happier?
Despite incredible gains in health, safety, wealth, there's this pervasive modern feeling of stress, anxiety, alienation, maybe lost direction.
We're amazing at figuring out how to do things.
But maybe we've lost sight of why. What's the ultimate goal of all this progress?
So what does this all mean for you listening to this deep dive? We've seen how dramatically the world has changed since 1500, driven by this new way of thinking, this relentless pursuit of knowledge and power.
Mm-hmm.
But as we stand here with these incredible capabilities, the question of whether it's actually leading to greater happiness, well, it remains profoundly open, doesn't it?
It really does. What's so remarkable is that constant interplay between our external progress, all the stuff we build and discover, and our internal state, our well-being.
Yeah.
We've mastered so much of the physical world, but understanding and cultivating, lasting happiness, that might just be our next great frontier.
So it raises a crucial question for you to think about, maybe. As technology keeps advancing, like exponentially,
Faster and faster.
how can we make sure that our pursuit of progress also aligns with our pursuit of meaning, of genuine happiness?
That's the challenge, isn't it? Making sure the why doesn't get lost in the how.
This deep dive has really only scratched the surface, of course. We'd encourage you to explore further the history of the scientific revolution itself, the ethics of all this new tech, the ongoing quest to figure out what happiness even is.
There's so much more out there. It's a fascinating and, frankly, vital area to understand.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive.